Nous allons donc enchaîner sur une table.
We're now going to move on to our next round table on operational safety in civil aviation and maritime transport. And I am joined here by Alexandre Brion, Head of Compliance and Safety at CMA CGM Air Cargo for the aviation industry. And Bertrand de Courville, you're very welcome, former captain, and later you were the head of safety at Air France, and currently you're an advisor for the brokerage firm Gallagher. I believe you all have your microphones ready. And perhaps one of our hostesses could come here on the stage to change the glasses. Apologies, it's a bit of a trek, but if you can please change the glasses, you should be able to find new glasses in the back, and most definitely we're going to need that water. So anyway, André Gaillard for the maritime sector, you'll speak to us about the current safety challenges. You're the president of the French Federation of Maritime Pilots, and you're based in Paris, quite paradoxically. Let's start by setting the context. I think it would be quite good for each and every one of you to speak to us about your day-to-day, starting with you, André, if you will. What's a maritime pilot, actually? What do you do? Because very often people are confused. Thank you very much, Cécile. Hello, everyone. Pascal Dubois, thank you so much for inviting me. I had a wonderful day yesterday and again today. Very interesting topics that are seldom tackled for maritime pilots. So maritime pilots are former captains in the merchant navy who are experts, who've become experts in maneuvering in ports, in places, and teamwork, as we will probably address later on with my colleagues from the aviation industry. Okay, so experts in places. What do I mean here? Pilots are specialists of a given geographic areas, for example in Le Havre, in Marseille, and in maneuvering, because maneuvering a ship means that you're going to move around your ship in a confined area. We've spoken about giant ships yesterday and even this morning. Ships have dramatically grown, which is not necessarily the case for port facilities, not to the same extent. And maritime pilots are also experts at teamwork. And indeed, when it comes to the management of risk, our job is quite exactly to manage risk. And for that, you need teamwork. Okay, perhaps you can share a little bit of an explanation on this picture. Well, this is what you can see from the deck of a 400-meter container ship. Here you have the port officer checking the positioning, allowing the docker and crew to board, and there you have it. We're pretty much 60 or 70 meters high, 400-meter long ship, and quite a huge ship indeed.
I know we've already skipped that, but so that we realize the sheer size. That's a very interesting picture because that's what we see from the bridge during whilst the ship is about to berth. So we feel that we are on the land, but you can see a factory, but we are in the avoidance area. So there are 200 meters around it, and that's the area where we will make a U-turn with the boat. And so it seems that we've got the bow on land, and on the other one you can see the back of the vessel being pulled on by a tug. That's how you bring the pilot on board the boat with a helicopter or a speedboat. And the pilot is somebody who goes physically on the boat to help the captain. Yes, I had to remove some pictures. No need to look for them. You're an aviation specialist, Alexandre. That's your bread and butter safety. Well, for me, it's much less impressive. But it's just because you haven't brought any picture. Well, we are in a safety department, and we are here to collect all reports, mostly from pilots, but all crew and staff, to derive risk from that and analyze activity from the risk management standpoint, so that we give management the right mitigation actions to put in place so that the safety level for the whole airline is kept at a good level. Our specificity also in aviation is that there are multiple players. The time when airlines managed everything themselves, maintenance, ground assistance, all that has been subcontracted. Concretely, for a freight operation, how many people, how many different players are operating to load, unload, supply, depending on the stopovers and how it's organized? We have between 15 and 25 different service providers maximum. There are some stopovers where the person putting the pallet together, weighing the pallet, scanning it and bringing it to the plane, and packaging us all. We know how it goes since yesterday's roundtable. Well, these are different people. And add to that all the people who went around the aircraft, pushing it back from the gates. That depends on the locations and regulations of each country. Bertrand, for you, what you need to have in mind, well, we've all taken a plane someday. What are the challenges for you? To me, it's everything that has to do with the specificities of flight. Well, I could see the maritime side because I was welcomed by the Le Havre maritime pilots on a 280-meter long boat, and I could see the quality of their work and the specificity of our job. For aviation and the flight bit that I know the best, if you stop, you fall. That's not a small difference, that's a huge difference. You can't drop anchor, you can't stop to request assistance, there are no tugboats. So the problem of common average, general average, doesn't exist for us. And on top of that, the survival time is limited to how much fuel you've got on board. So we have a lot of constraints in our environment for all these reasons. Everything that flows from that, standard operating procedures, selection and training programs for pilots, all that is here to give a lot of decision-making and action autonomy to the crew. If you think of everything that's going on during a flight, well, most of the time it happens very well, but I looked at what happened in the last 2 weeks in the world. So many things that required analysis and decisions on board to stop takeoff, to reapply a thrust. There was a reactor breakdown, a burst tire, smoke exhaust on board, something we fear on the plane because we've got no easy solution to fix that. A pilot passing out, collision with birds at takeoff, a broken windscreen. That's just a small part of what went on in the world. We won't dare take the plane anymore. Well, you'd never hear about that because everything goes smoothly, because everything's organized for that. But you talked about a lot of things that are quite scary, but I wanted to ask the three of you, what keeps you up at night? What are the big risks for you? I would mention 4 main risks at the moment that keep me quite busy, keep me thinking. The first one, you can see that on TV every day, is the geopolitical situation. There's conflict all around the world, and that has an impact on our operations. About 10 years ago, we didn't ask ourselves about whether we would be hit by a missile, but now I've been asked to conduct risk analyses about the fact that we could get shot at. Well, routes have changed, haven't they? And they are less free. Yes, absolutely. Especially traffic from Europe to Asia and back. We're now going south of Russia because we can no longer fly over Russia. We can no longer fly over Iran. So it's a corridor that's about 200 to 300 kilometers wide on the continent. And so the slightest military operation in the area could shut traffic down. And I would add to that, well, there will be a roundtable this afternoon on GPS, GNSS jamming, but 100% of flights that go there are jammed. They lose GPS entirely, so that's a big risk. Second big risk is cybersecurity, I think. For the moment, nobody's been able to hack into a plane, but zero risk is not a thing. We all know that. So it's bound to happen someday. We need to start thinking about it now, seriously, because we don't know what would happen if someday somebody was able to hack a plane. The third risk, that's what I mentioned at the beginning, the multiplicity of players. So we need to be able to investigate and look at the liability chain to find the root cause of events. And necessarily, and in fact, it's a governance risk. Yes, it is, absolutely. And the last one is the flip side of what I said earlier on. As soon as you've got a lot of players with computer reporting so that you've got a lot of information, well, people are almost flooded. There's over-reporting. They're flooded by information. But the fact that there was a knot that was slightly loose is not the same fact as having a 400-kilo pallet that's loose on a plane. And so that's the real risk for all this reporting. Bertrand may be talking about the aircraft that do take off. What's the biggest risk? You've described a few scenarios. We have a number of disaster movies in mind. There are a lot of movies about horrors that happen in flight. Well, that's what helped aviation make progress. There's intolerance to risk when it comes to safety. Whenever there's an accident, a crash, it makes the headlines, and that's why there has been progress. Accidents and deaths are intolerable for us, and that's brought about a lot of progress. What keeps me up at night? It's a direct question, but if that keeps me up at night, that means that I've got doubts about precise things, and we've got a lot of ways to take action on this precise point. We cancel a flight, we stop a plane, we won't let doubts go on forever. But it's true that aviation produces risk, and so my answer would be a bit broad. What we need to fear the most is overconfidence. We've got such a level of safety now that casualties happen every 10 million flights. It's a considerable problem. Even in the last 3 decades, we've kept making progress. Last year, there was the Air India crash that caused a lot of death, but with a single accident. There are fewer and fewer crashes, but when it's a big, heavy plane, it's very painful. So the risk of overconfidence because of that safety level. Very quickly, people can get comfortable and think that what's protected us so far will keep protecting us in the future, but reality is very different. Everything is changing. Constraints and people are changing. Economic and geopolitical constraints are changing, as we said. That's constantly introducing new scenarios, new accident risks. And these risks are those that we need to be able to identify as early as possible. Alexandre has talked about them. But I would add maybe some precise things. Turbulence is now very present and causing serious incidents and accidents because there are people injured on flights. Last year, Singapore Airlines had a casualty because of turbulence, and you can connect that to climate change. And so this is something we need to look at. And you can also ask Mistral or ChatGPT, asking them about emerging risk for the next few years in terms of security and safety. Both would answer. I won't read the whole list, but it's interesting to ask AI, and I can see that they're mixing safety and security. But it's not quite the same thing. a terrorist attack is security. We'll talk about security later. We'll talk about that on a specific item, but sometimes one can drift into the other. When a plane crashes, you never know if that's safety or security. What keeps sea pilots awake at night, apart the fact that it's probably very stressful? We saw your picture, the helicopter over Dunkirk, airdropping a pilot. There are 3 pilotage stations airdropping pilots. We are 330 pilots and we have about 800 operations every year. Well, as we said, the world is now more maritime than ever. Asia is the workshop of the planet, and so most goods go from continent to continent, including for commodities. 90% of cargo trade is done on seas and rivers, so it's now, of course, a sovereignty issue, as was mentioned by Mr. de Banel yesterday. When it comes to maritime expeditions, as we call them, it's when you're entering or leaving a harbor or near the coastline that you're the closest to risk. That's why you were asking me what keeps me awake at night. Well, risks are increased when entering or leaving ports because of shallows or traffic from all sorts of ships. Well, you have vessels that you can communicate with, but there are also pleasure boaters, kite surfers crossing your route. I had a kite surfer going under the bow of my 400-meter container ship. And so you see them disappear and then reappear again on the other side, and you hope simply that they didn't go under. But pilots' risks, well, there's the risk of being grounded and collision. Well, we also move in 4 dimensions, especially in sea harbors. I'll ask the question you've already answered, but what's the difference between grounding and scuttling? Well, grounding is involuntary, scuttling is voluntary, deliberate. Well, there are also some safety maneuvers. If the ship is taking water, you can decide to scuttle it to save it and avoid it sinking. Collision was discussed yesterday. I think we know about that. 2 ships colliding, and then you can have a collision between a ship and a crane, for instance. There was an accident in Jebel Ali where a ship collided with a crane. The crane fell onto the containers and one of them exploded. Well, there's an economic risk for the vessel, for dockers. If you are 1 crane short, it takes years to order a crane and receive it, and there's the availability of the quayside and also possibilities of injuries and casualties, risk of fire and explosion. So there are many, many risks. So moving on with you, how do you reduce these risks concretely? Somebody said yesterday that 80 to 90% of accidents were due to human error. That's kind of true, but that's a 1970s view of things. Until the 60s or 70s, well, that was a boomer, says Cécile. Well, until the 60s and 70s, we improved safety in risky industry, aviation, transport, nuclear. Conditions improved in these risky industries. The risk of accident was lowered by improving materials, products with, well, now you no longer have any planes that disintegrate at 10,000 feet because a door was not designed correctly. From the 70s onwards, we cared about the human factor, HR aspects, relations inside the cockpit. But talking about the cockpit, that's not your field. Talk about boats, rather. Well, it's the same thing, but that was started by 1977. The Tenerife crash, which was the biggest crash in the aviation world, with over 500 casualties. So the human factor, we worked a lot on the human factor, and in the subsequent years we kept making progress, and now we're talking about systemic risk and organizational risk. So we wondered about the fact that there's not just the boat or the aircraft, but we were moving around in a system. For us, there's the tugboat, port officers, the harbor master, and so on. And so also an organizational risk, because we're talking about recruitment, initial training and continuous training, rest time, working hours, all that needs to be taken into account. And that's what is summarized on this diagram. That's put together by James Reason, who was a British researcher who passed away a year ago. James Reason created the Swiss cheese model. If you align the holes on all these systems that were created to avoid accidents, well, then that leads to an accident. But if you have more and more layers, you have less risk of accident. And on this diagram, you can see the importance of experience feedback, be it in aviation or maritime. We've worked a lot on experience feedback, post-mortems. Well, Bertrand, that's your experience. We talked about the fact that the cockpit that used to be accessible is no longer. Well, that's what James Reason did. With this simple diagram, he could fully transform the way we viewed accidents that used to be attributed to direct causes, first-line actors who made mistakes. But the merit of this diagram is to show that there are two levels of causality, of latent causality, with defense in depth, as it's called, and that contributes to avoiding accidents. Maybe about risk, three things that will allow us to go forward, working on safety on a cooperative basis. Now we've got very similar organizations in airlines. The way we conduct operations is very similar. We've got similar or shared aircraft. So what happens in an airline someday has every chance of happening in another airline. So when we learn from everybody's incidents or accidents, that improves things. But you need a lot of sharing and transparency and a lot of shared work. That happens in the technical world. When an aircraft flies, when there's a technical problem, it's shared with every airline. It's not so widely shared on organizational dysfunction, but we need to make progress on that. We need to invest in people as well. When talking about accidents, you regularly talk about human error. 70 to 80% of accidents had a human contribution at the beginning, but also people can contribute to safety. There's recent work over the period 2007-2016 that showed that pilots could address malfunctions in flights in real time on over 244 million flights, about 20% of flights. And at the same time, 310 accidents are attributed to human error over the same period. If you compare, pilots intervene so that flights could end safely, and nobody talked about it, 628,000 times for every single accident. So we need to talk about people's contribution to safety. Of course, there's still error. We need to reduce it, but there's great potential that we're not using enough because we're not working on it enough. So we need to invest in it. And last thing, in an air safety system where safety is already very high, we know the figures that are relatively good. They're never good enough, of course, but every time that there's an accident, we need to put actions in place to improve the whole system. But we're at such a level of safety that the safety gains that can be expected are relatively low, but the secondary impacts years after, unwanted impacts, can lead you to lose that safety gain, but even worse, you can deteriorate safety. For instance, having bulletproof doors after the 9/11 attacks in New York, that was a necessary measure that we understand. But years later, it made it possible to have the Chernomyinsk accident that was tragic because the cockpit door was bulletproof and you can no longer get access to the cockpit because of that system. So you need to be very cautious when you make improvements. You need to weigh the pros and cons, and that's one of the challenges in safety improvement now. What's your view on risk reduction, Alexandre? At a technical department, what we do is we go as far as possible with the risk analysis so that, as I said before, we can identify the main risks that we're facing. We're using exactly the same one as described here. We are trying to find the unwanted effects, loss of control. Very often, that's around procedure and training because we are the airline, we're not the authority. So that's where we start. Way ahead of an accident, that's what matters. So if you analyze this process as finely as possible, you'll find the location where there's a weakness to correct and fix, and we need to fix it with the aviation players because they'll be in charge of putting that action in place so that we have mitigation measures in place. So here, that's management. Yes, absolutely. Well, we've got a great audience of insurers. Very quickly, your message for them, what is it directly? What would you want to say to insurers? There are two things that come to mind for me. As we said earlier, Bertrand was talking about error, mistakes. Well, we need to speak the same language, and we speak the same language as civil aviation. You need to distinguish between a mistake and fault. Fault is disregarding a rule, going through a red light, drinking under the influence. But error, mistake is an omission. I mean, to err is human, after all, and so we can always improve safety conditions in transport, but we need to prove that to err is human, and human beings make mistakes by definition. And so, as Bertrand said earlier, we want to reduce the number of mistakes, but we want to be able to detect them and fix them. And in order to fix them and detect them in time, the only thing that can save us is teamwork. So we need to understand that when there's an accident that leads to a disaster, as we said earlier, there's not just one person who made a mistake. Generally, there are several, because when one person makes a mistake, teamwork helps fix these mistakes. But let's be clear about it. Mistakes are insured against. That's the message. Another message? Well, when talking about the future, almost all of you are insurers. Let's talk about technology, drones, remote operated vessels, autonomous vessels or unmanned vessels. Now, who's liable if you have an autonomous vessel? Who is the programmer, the one who wrote the code lines, responsible? If you have a remote operated vessel, is the guy in his little shack at the other end of the world who's remotely operating a vessel considered as the captain? That's going to be a real problem for insurers. Well, André is asking you to set up a working group. If you want to work on all that, please do. Your message to insurers, Bertrand. I worked for a broker, a big broker, Gallagher. So what Gallagher is doing is that they are committed to supporting and providing operational support to their customers. And that's the team that I'm a part of. We are providing on ground losses and incidents that mean a lot of cost for airlines and insurers. And also Gallagher is part of the Flight Safety Foundation, and they're on the board of directors. So Gallagher is really committed to its clients, and so doing everything they can for safety. Well, that's not really a message, but an avenue for thinking based on all the risks that we have talked about. How do insurers tackle them, and how could we work better hand in hand to have adequate insurance cover for a given operational risk. To wrap up, André, I think that you've already answered. Let's look to the future. Maybe we can add another projection, or do you think that it's the message about drones that's important? Yes, I sort of preempted the last question about the future, but once again, I'd like to come back. I know there are experts in the room. When analyzing an accident, try to determine all the causes that led to an accident. It's never a single cause. There's never just a single person involved in an accident. The recent history of accidentology proves it. There are always several causes when there's an accident that leads to a catastrophe. That is really the takeaway here. Bertrand, the takeaway from this roundtable? Well, for autonomous flights and all that, well, not only if you want, but what is the takeaway in terms of safety for us? You need to invest into people, that's essential. You need to take a closer look at people and help crews with technology own this specific position in flight of being able to find solutions quickly to reduce cases and scenarios when the crew has confusing information, ambiguous information available. So they need to be helped in this high-level decision-making, and they need to be trained well and supported in their work. You talked about reasonable paranoia. Is that a phrase we should remember? Well, yes, absolutely. That's from James Reason. I worked with James Reason when I worked at Air France. We brought him over to Air France, and we were thinking about internal messaging inside the company. And so he came to two messages. Never forget to be afraid. We need to help an airline stay vigilant. And he reformulated that into a modicum of paranoia in every action that we do in operational terms. That is the definition of procedures, equipment of planes, maintenance, loading. There should always be an inch of doubt, but this paranoia needs to be reasonable. I don't know whether that exists, reasonable paranoia, but that expresses the idea well. I don't know what psychological experts would think about that, but we understand what it means in aviation. Alexandre, your takeaway. My takeaway is similar to what was said before. Teamwork. With ground operators, that's essential. With management, with the entire aviation ecosystem, especially as I said, there are a lot of players working with suppliers, also with regulators like IATA or ICAO. That will help us reduce risk. And why not with insurers? Yes, absolutely. Thank you to the three of you. Thank you, Cécile.